But I just wanted to talk briefly about test cutting because it's very, very useful part of our training. It's something that honestly was completely forgotten, I would say. When I started training years ago, decades ago now, you'd often hear people say, straight swords don't cut well, which I just bought into. You know, people say that, oh, okay, straight swords don't cut well. I didn't really think about it. But then when I was training with Wang Laoshi, he mentioned that in the past, Chinese did test cutting on caoren, grassmen. Of course, you know, in those days, you didn't order mats or something. You bundled up whatever local materials you could get, would have been different north or south, and practiced your cutting techniques on them. So I thought, this is important because like any tool, you can't say you know how to use a tool if you haven't practiced using it. You can't take a paintbrush and, you know, imagine doing a painting with nice breathing exercises put to it like a form and then think that you're a painter. That would be ridiculous. Nobody would think you're a great painter if you only did it in the air. Nobody can think you're a great swordsman if you just waved your sword around in the air. You have to show that you can do it. And so test cutting is really very, very valuable. And there's different targets for different cuts. If you're doing a quick little cut, you're not cutting through something that's thick, even like a single mat. If you're doing a more powerful cut and you do it through a little thin target, well, that's not a very good test of that either. So you can use different targets, in my case, I use different thicknesses of bamboo for different cuts. So if you're doing a quick little cut, quick pea cut, for example, or a tiao or something, you can do it with a fairly thin piece of bamboo because you're only looking to maybe cut the fingers or just give a somewhat superficial cut, but perhaps telling to the arm or something. If you're doing a liao cut or a duo, then you can use much thicker target, a tougher target. I like bamboo because it's cheap. It's a non-native invasive species. Got it growing in my yard in places where it's pretty much controlled. It still has escaped, got into my neighbor's yard. So when the spring comes and I see them popping up, he's a good guy. I go over to his yard and I cut out the sprouts when they're first coming up, and that keeps it from really spreading. So if you plant bamboo, just be advised, 10 years down the line, you're going to have a lot of cutting material and you're going to have to pay attention to controlling it, especially if you're doing the running type of bamboo, which is what I have here. I have bamboo that will get as thick as 2 inches in diameter, sometimes a little bit wider than that, which is really quite convenient. The nice thing about bamboo is that you have this tall piece and you can practice multiple cuts very well. So I might do a liao down into a pea cut, or a pea cut and a pea cut, or 2 liao cuts, some combination. You can do 3 cuts. Later on you can have 2 targets and you might step up liao, and it's a really nice way to practice. What I also wanted to point out though for you is clarify, because of course these days everybody and their uncle does test cutting. And that's good. Well, it's good in the sense that people are trying something and training. Sometimes I'm honestly a little concerned because this can be very dangerous practice. Frankly, you should approach test cutting the way you would going to a gun range. Right? If you've ever anybody's done any shooting, they can tell you that there's a range master there and that guy has dictatorial powers, because if there's an accident, it's a serious accident. If you've ever been to a gun range, it's very controlled. The chances of an accident should be quite small, but if there's an accident, it's really serious accident. So you have to be like really, really overly cautious, and the range master can throw you out. They're usually armed. They'll draw on you if you're doing something stupid. So you have to be very careful. It's the same thing. You're using a sword. A sword can cut somebody's limb right off. I saw a post years ago where an individual was doing something which everybody says you shouldn't do. He was cutting by himself. And he was out behind his house where a lot of saplings grew. He lived in a rural area. And he was just practicing cutting. And something else you shouldn't do is cut when the ground is wet. He slipped. He was using a gladius. He slipped, went down, and cut about halfway through his leg. I don't think he hit the bone, but just missed the bone, cutting through the back of his calf. He nearly bled out. He nearly died. He said he couldn't walk. He was about 50 meters from his back door, and he crawled back home. So those kinds of accidents can happen. You should have on long pants, jeans, something that's not so easy to cut. Some people will wear glasses, and it's not a bad idea, especially if you're new, you have a lanyard to your wrist, from the pommel to your wrist. You can tie something on so that if it slips from your hand, it doesn't go flying. You mark the area to keep everybody away, and so on. So if you're not familiar with these things, don't just go out and buy something and cut it up, or cut up something out of the trash. Read my book. I did a whole book on test cutting. It's full of a lot of things that are common sense, but sometimes we need to be reminded of common sense. Anyway, comes the bamboo. This is from the same stalk. Now, I think if you look at them just quickly like this, they'll look very much the same. This bit was probably at least 1.5, maybe even twice as hard to cut. This is the lower part. So if you see here, if you kind of compare the walls, which is the thicker part, this is even different from one end to the other. This is the bottom quarter. If you look at particularly the tops where it's sliced through, you see the angle's pretty much the same. If you look through that top part, it is about, it's 1.5 times as thick. And when you add that all the way around, this is considerably harder to cut. So when you see somebody cut a piece of bamboo, if I'm cutting the central part of that bamboo stalk, this is about 2 stories tall, so that would be about 6 meters, say, something like that, 6-7 meters tall. This central part, cut through. You know, anybody with skills, practice, is going to be able to do fairly easily. You got to give it a good shot. It's not going to go easily. It's about as tough as a single mat, depending how long the mat has been soaked. It's in the same ballpark. It's not quite as wide, so it's a little different in how it cuts, but it's going to take about the same skill, same effort. This bottom part is quite different to cut. So if you're experienced, you can tell even from the sound it makes when it's cutting. But just kind of keep in mind that when you see cutting demonstrations, it's not all equal. Big difference what piece of the bamboo you're cutting. And even if you look at this piece of bamboo, might not be so clear here on screen, but this is what is that? It's about a foot-long section, a little bit more than a foot. So this is just, I went tung, tung, I cut once, and then I cut again. So this is the bottom. You can see when it cut, tung, was a big piece, tung, and it fell and it stuck into the ground. That's why it's a little bit dirty there. If you look at how thick the walls are there, so I would say it's about 5 millimeters, okay? If you look at that. So not even 1/4 of an inch. Go to the other side, look how much thinner that is. Just what would that be, about 30-some centimeters apart, right? So this, I would say, it's more like 3.5 centimeters. And that may not sound like a lot, but when you add that up all the way around, it starts being different. Now, that's not going to be a gigantic difference, but it shows you how, if you have a piece of bamboo, that's 30-some centimeters. If you have a piece of bamboo that's 2 meters long, the bit you cut in the middle and the bit you cut at the bottom is quite different. So really, really, really very, very different. And this was, even though I haven't cut in probably about 2 years for a variety of reasons, mostly because of traveling and then being super busy setting up the academy. So this wasn't tough. This I had to really give a good wallop to. And the first time I cut it, because I've been cutting and feeling good, going through these, nice sharp boom each time, said, all right, time to cut the tougher stuff. And the first time I went through, just through, and it latched a little piece there, so it went instead of the last little thread didn't quite cut 100%. So my sword didn't get caught, came and cut out, but showed you, like, These, thunk right through, no problem. I had to adjust my power level and bring it up, really level it up for this one. So, big difference what part of the bamboo you're cutting. The nice thing too about this stalk, of course, is the very top was quite thin, and then I can practice after I've practiced. Well, you can warm up with the thin stuff, and then you can work your way down to the tougher stuff, changing the type of cuts that you do at the end. So this I'm using maybe a door cut or a really big P cut for the, you could even hear. Okay. Sound of that. Hear I sound so different? You'll notice now. Now when you watch someone cutting bamboo, listen to the sound. You'll know. Because sometimes people are, everybody likes to show off. I've shown off. I can't criticize others for doing it. But you'll be able to tell how tough of a cut was that really. When someone says, oh, I cut through a 2-inch piece of bamboo. Well, that's a 2-inch piece of bamboo, and that's a 2-inch piece of bamboo. And this is at least 1.5 times as hard, as difficult, okay? Same thing goes for mats. Last thing before we get started with our Gen Fa. Single mat, it's a good target, about so thick. Not particularly hard to cut, not easy either. It's a good, solid cut target. I like to put a piece of bamboo in the middle, about an inch and a quarter piece of bamboo. So not nearly as tough as cutting one of these, just to give it a little bit more solidity, kind of simulate a bone. And because the single mats, so I practiced a fair amount. I wouldn't say it's easy for me, but it's not a big challenge either. So just to make it a little bit more challenging, I like to put a bamboo in the center and wrap that around it. But keep in mind, the longer you soak your mats, the easier they are to cut. And if you soak them in cold water versus hot water, big difference in how they are to cut. So if you see somebody cut something really thick, maybe it's totally legit. Maybe they soaked it for 12 hours in hot water. You don't know that. Unlike with the bamboo where you can hear the sound, you're not going to hear that. You can also notice, though, when you see it cut, is there a spray of water? Because that means they didn't dry them as long. Usually with mats, you soak them. If you soak them, usually I soak them about 6 hours. It's been a while since I've done it. It doesn't seem to make a big difference if you did it 5 hours. I don't do it that long. Probably do about 4 hours generally. If it took you a little longer and soaked 4.5, 5 hours, it's not a gigantic difference, but if you soak it 7 hours, it's going to be really different. And then you take it out and you let it dry about half as much time as it's soaked. So if you take them right out, just let them drain and cut them, it's much easier. So if you see a cut and there's a spray of water, it's an easier target. So you can get a little more gauge of what was really being presented there. So anyway, quick thing, but absolutely, if you're thinking of test cutting, great. Start with easy targets. Plastic bottles are fine to start with. Take them out of the recycling bin, put them back when you're done. So you're not adding to trash. Make sure there's somebody around in case you have an error. And please take the time to read my book on the topic, because there are lots of little things that you might not think of that really are important for safety.